Hello, I'm Chris Williamson, and welcome to our latest No to NATO, No to War broadcast. We've got another stellar panel of speakers for tonight's discussion, who I'll be introducing in a moment. They include a former president, a retired diplomat, we hope, if we can get him. I know we're having some technical difficulties reaching him, but we're hoping he's going to be with us. Politicians, journalists, and broadcasters. But firstly, let's remember that this Sunday marks the 78th infamous anniversary of the dreadful day when the United States dropped the world's first atomic bomb. The unsuspecting population of the Japanese city of Hiroshima were the first victims of this horrific new weapon of mass destruction. 3 days later, the people of Nagasaki suffered the same fate. Tens of thousands were vaporized and hundreds of thousands were injured. And many of those went on to die agonizing deaths. Thankfully, no nuclear weapons have been used since the end of World War II. But NATO's proxy war against Russia that's being fought out in Ukraine is pushing us closer and closer to a nuclear nightmare. How did it come to this? Who's benefiting from all this carnage? Well, it certainly isn't the people of Ukraine who are paying with their lives. And ordinary people in Europe, and indeed the United States for that matter, are facing ballooning food and energy bills as a direct consequence of the West's counterproductive sanctions against Russia. The truth is, the only people benefiting from prolonging this proxy war with its attendant risk of provoking World War III are the military-industrial complex. The United States Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, people may have seen this, was unashamedly explicit when he spoke on the Senate floor a couple of months ago. He said, and I quote, "Most of the money that's been appropriated for Ukraine security assistance doesn't actually go to Ukraine. It gets invested in American defense manufacturing." So we're risking nuclear war to generate profits for the likes of Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. Britain's weapons manufacturers like BAE Systems are also cashing in, as are the European equivalents. But the fact that the merchants of death are making a financial killing out of this proxy war shouldn't really be a surprise. Smedley Butler, the famous US general who wrote a book about the war being a racket almost 88 years ago, he summed it up when he said, the title of his book was "War is a Racket." So let me introduce tonight's exceptional panel of speakers who come from a range of political perspectives. Angela McArdle is the chair of the US Libertarian Party's National Committee. Donald Ramota is the former president of Guyana. Peter Ford, who we're hoping we can reach, I know we're having some technical difficulties, but he's served as a former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. We're also hoping to have Helga Zepp-LaRouche, but again, there are some technical difficulties, but I think we'll have those sorted. We're hoping anyway before the end of the broadcast. And she founded the Schiller Institute. David Clues is with us. He's the lead correspondent for the Unity News Network. Dan Kovalik is an author, a lawyer, and a human rights advocate. And last but by no means least is Richard Medhurst. And again, we may or may not be able to reach him because of the problems with our technical difficulties. But anyway, let's hope that we can get hold of Richard as well. He's an outstanding independent journalist and broadcaster. So perhaps if we could maybe start with you, Angela, and maybe you could just sort of say some opening remarks and maybe comment on how the war is being viewed in the United States, because what we hear, certainly in the United Kingdom from the corporate media, is a kind of universal support, but I'm not sure that's necessarily reflected universally anyway across the wider general public. I mean, what's the situation over in the US?
In the United States, it's really a mix. For example, I had the most painful conversation yesterday with a former United States congressman who could not bring himself to admit that the US played any sort of role in this war. And he was opposed to working together to oppose the war. He was highly critical of the rallies we've had and the work that we're doing to work with people on the left. I will work with communists to oppose nuclear war. I think it's one of the most important issues in existence. But there are a lot of people who are absolutely opposed to the war if for nothing else, at least for economic reasons, a lot of people are starting to become more sensitive to the issue. They see the carnage. Social media has made it much easier to connect with people in other places in the world and really see the humanity in each other. And if we can't see the humanity in each other, we can't see human beings on the other side of this war. That's a real problem. Is it war that forces us to confront humanity sort of head on with all of its flaws and wonders and vulnerabilities? I worry that some of us actively choose to reject it because we've taken on this sort of anti-human sentiment. And I'm not sure where that comes from, but it does make me nervous. I'd like to think that the specter of war is enough to scare us straight. I don't want to be at war. A lot of other people here do not want to be at war. We don't want blood in our streets, so we wouldn't want that anywhere else. And I think about the Russian and Ukrainian soldiers who were conscripted into the war and who have prejudices and may hate each other, and how all of that melts away maybe when you're faced with live combat, and then you really wonder, what are we doing here? But in spite of all of that, I think a lot of people are waking up to the dangers of American empire and globalist expansion through organizations like NATO and the UN, maybe quite frankly. Um, and I think that it's really important for us to push for peace and de-escalation every chance we get. In politics, obviously, but also in culture, in education, and in our families, because I think it really starts at home. And the cost of war is just too great. And I'd say as we remember the people who died in Japan this weekend at that horrible incident, I think we should work to make sure that those war crimes and tragedies of that level like never happen again, because I don't want to see it in my lifetime.
No, indeed. And Angela, I mean, are there any events planned to commemorate the 78th anniversary of that awful day when the first atomic weapon was dropped on Hiroshima?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a rally that's planned in New York City at the UN building, and it's called Humanity for Peace, and that's going to be taking place very soon, this Sunday afternoon.
Excellent, excellent. Well, let me bring in Donald Ramota now. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us this evening, Your Excellency. I wonder if you might sort of comment on the situation as you see it, because what we hear in the Western corporate media is that the international community is fully behind NATO's proxy war in Ukraine, but their definition of the international community is only a relatively small proportion of the world's population. So what's the situation like in Guyana? And from your perspective, I mean, how do you see this war playing out?
First of all, thanks for having me on. It is the situation, the dangerous situation that now exists in the world, unfortunately, is not strongly reflected in the population in Guyana and in the Caribbean as a whole. I think that has got to do with the source of our information, which we get here, is most people get fundamentally from the mainstream media in the United States and so forth. And as a result of that, there is not a very high level of consciousness as to the dangers that we face. I would say, frankly, that the dangers far outpace the consciousness that exists in our society. Um, uh, and I would say also that what is also very unfortunate is that the memories are very, very short, and what happened in Japan in 1945, 78 years ago, seems to have been forgotten. After the end of the Second World War, and after the destruction of Japan with the dropping of these bombs, many people were saying never again, never again. But it seems to me, as people of that generation passed on, that once again there are some crazy people who believe that they can win a war in today's world when the two main protagonists are people who are stuck with a lot of very, very important weapons, very big weapons. The weapons today are thousands of times more dangerous than what exploded in Japan 78 years ago. And that consciousness seems to have been, in some cases, deliberately played down, like in our region here, and I would say, in Europe and North America, it seems to have been forgotten, or the memory is dulled by the passing of time. It is very clear that NATO has never been a defensive organization as it is proclaimed to be. The NATO has always been an organization. It was formed under the pretext of stopping stopping communism, but it was used to fight against all kinds of organization that was fighting for better position against the domination of transnational cooperation and the exploitation of people generally. In Europe, over the years since the formation of NATO, most governments have been elected, largely had to, first of all, be supportive of the American position as far as in foreign policy was concerned, or if they were those who at the beginning were opposed to it, they quickly conformed in the passage of time because of the power of America, both militarily and economically in Europe. And today, NATO is turning Europe virtually into a colony. How else can we explain the fact that countries like Germany have been taking decisions that goes contrary to their own interests? Germany is now becoming uncompetitive in the international arena with some of the other big players in the international economy. But they go along with supporting the United States, and many other countries in Europe are actually doing the same, taking position against their own country's interests, against their own people's interests, which shows that they have lost a lot of their independence and their freedom, which is extremely sad to see, because with such a history and such a history of standing up and such a culture that we have in Europe, that they have succumbed to a kind of a neo-colonial situation in our day, for a want of a better word. I can't find a better word to describe what has taken place there. So I would say that we have to revive the call, not only to end this war, but to end all the big weapons of mass destruction, that nuclear weapons should be eliminated from the world. It started with one country in 1949, it spread to two in 1960, and now there are but at least 7 or 8 countries, and many are fighting to want to have these weapons in the belief that it will give them protection. It is totally wrong. I think it was Einstein who said that you can't expect to have peace if you're preparing for war. And in today's times, to me, that idea has become more potent, to think about what is happening now in Europe, what can happen, because we were at the brink in such a dangerous situation, and we just are now hoping that nuclear weapons are not used. And that is, to my mind, part of the tragedy, that we all live on this planet, big or small countries, large or weak or large economies. We all live on on this continent, on the world, and the vast majority of people do not want war. They want peace. They want an end to war. Does not serve people's interests. Look at the misery that it's causing, even at local levels. But we have no say in what is going on, and that is why I'm very happy to be part of this conversation today, and to congratulate those in Europe and in North America who are taking to the streets to try to stop this, because I believe there is no shortcut, that people's involvement is becoming very, very vital to, holding the hands of those who want to use war to enrich themselves, and even to the point where they are probably willing to commit suicide by starting such a war. So that would be my initial comments at this point in time.
No, well, thank you very much, Your Excellency. And We are very pleased and indeed privileged that you've taken the time out to join us this evening. I just may ask one supplementary question, though. I mean, obviously, you've served at the very highest level in politics as the president of your country. So I'm just wondering whether you've got any sense of the mentality of the political leaders in the West who are pushing this war, and there doesn't seem to be any, as far as I can see anyway, no sane voices seem to be emerging that are calling for peace negotiations to bring this war to an end. All we seem to hear about, certainly in the British media anyway, is bellicose calls for more and more, as they refer to it, lethal aid to be sent to Ukraine to prosecute the war. I mean, I guess you must have rubbed shoulders with some of the characters who are in the upper echelons of the decision makers within NATO. What is it that, I mean, what's driving these characters? I mean, as you say in your remarks there, it's almost as if they're wanting to commit collective suicide. I mean, do you have a sense of what's driving them?
First of all, I think first there's the particularly from the side of the United States, there is very, very clear to me that there is a ego issue, probably one. The other one that's one they feel that they should dominate, that they're the biggest economy in the world, they're the biggest military in the world, that they want to dominate the world. I think that is one that exists. And in many of the other countries, particularly the more developed countries, there are some who probably have in Europe who got some of the same opinion, but I believe most of them are afraid of sanctions because for more and more the Americans have been using sanctions one way or the other to push people in line, government in line, and many people are afraid of being faced with sanctions. I think this is a new situation that has happened with Russia, the sanctions that they put on Russia. Russia seems to be the first country who has been able to stand up to some of the pressures and some of the hardship, to avoid many of the hardship that a lot of these sanctions cause to people. Look at what is happening in Cuba, what is happening in Venezuela, what is probably happening in Nicaragua. Many of these countries that have been victims of economic sanctions have not been able to stand up the way Russia has. This is the first time that a country seems to be successfully standing up against the massive sanctions that have been thrown against it. So I believe many leaders are afraid of facing that type of struggle, and recognizing at many times it will create a lot of hardship in their own country and possibly end up in them losing government. And that is one of the things that I think is a part of the problem.
Well, thank you for that insight. I wonder if our technical people have managed to reach either Peter Ford or Helga Zapt-Larouche. Are either of those on the... hang on, I'll have to look because I can't see without my glasses. Have we got Peter there?
Yes, you do.
Excellent, here. Peter. Because very good, Peter. We were concerned because I think there were some technical difficulties reaching you. So I'm delighted you've managed to join us. Obviously, Peter, I mean, you just heard me speaking there to Donald Ramota and obviously his role as in a very senior level as president of his country. You served in a very senior position in the British diplomatic service, and will have obviously then had experience of working with ministers and people in the upper echelons of government. How do you read the situation? Because as Donald was saying there, it seems as if some of these, well, not some, all of them seem to be moving towards a situation where they're happy to commit collective suicide. It's astonishing that we're in this situation. There don't seem to be any sane voices being heard in the policy making rooms of the NATO countries. What's your take on the situation, Peter?
Well, I think there are a mix of factors involved here. First of all, there's just classic traditional British jingoism. We are world champions telling ourselves how wonderful we are and how the rest of the world looks to us for lessons, and we love to lay down the law. We're British, that's what we do. And our brand of British imperialism is the best in the world. So that's the straightforward jingoism, and the country is in the middle of a fever of jingoism, possibly more noticeable in this country than most other countries in the West, at least in the United States. There is something of a debate. Here there is absolutely none, which is always a suspicious sign in a democracy. When everybody agrees, clearly something is wrong. And secondly, there is self-delusion. I call it RDS, Russia Derangement Syndrome, closely linked to CDS, China Derangement Syndrome. And we deluded ourselves into thinking that we are the victims, that these terrible countries in the East, Russia and China, are out to get us, when in fact all the evidence points in the other direction, and that Russia is justified in thinking that we and our NATO partners have marched up to their borders. The Chinese are justified in thinking that principally the United States, but with Britain and Australia tagging along, we have put our ships into the Pacific. We have started to try to encircle China. We are the ones making the threatening noises. And then there is, perhaps thirdly, in this mix of motives, there is ugly, naked self-interest. There's money to be made, careers to be made, and then people are afraid to put their heads above the parapet. They might lose a lucrative contract or even a job.
Yeah. I mean, are the politicians just in the grip of the military-industrial complex? I was making the point, I don't know if you heard it, Peter, because we were struggling to reach you when I was doing the introductory remarks. I made the point about the military-industrial complex and how it seems that this war is being prosecuted, or the only people that's benefited from the prosecution of this war in Ukraine are the military-industrial complex, who are making a lot of money out of it. And indeed, I quoted Mitch McConnell's remarks on the floor of the Senate when he said that the money that's being used for Ukrainian aid is actually coming back to fund essentially US defense manufacturing. Does that explain it? Is that, or is it more complex than that, do you think?
I think it's a bit more complex than that. There's ideology involved as well. But to take the most obvious things first, yes, there's money involved. The money to fund the defense so-called think tanks, which is a contradiction in terms. They are paid or receive a big part of their funding. Colleges like the Royal Defence Studies College, a large part of their funding from the arms industry. And there's a nexus with government. They also receive funding from the British government, Ministry of Defence and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. There's a nexus there between academe and big business and government. This is the deep state at work. That is how it works. It's a nexus of the defense and intelligence agencies, and it's hard to put your finger on who is actually leading the dance. It's a complex. It's a nexus. It's a web, a deep state web. But then there's also ideology, emotion. a sense of moral self-righteousness, and good old neo-imperialism, that we wish to be top dogs. And you should never underestimate the power of ideas, ideology, and emotion. Nation states are not rational actors. This is a total illusion. They don't act in accordance with the national interest. Our national interest would dictate pursuit of peace and trade and prosperity. The pursuit of war and aggression is not in the national interest.
In your experience, Peter, how, just before I move on to Helga, how responsive do you think the powers that be are to public opinion? Obviously, what we are trying to do, as you know, in No2NATO, is build a movement in opposition to NATO and opposition to war. I mean, are the policymakers, in your experience, the people in Whitehall, are they responsive to that kind of public opinion? What's your thoughts?
Well, in the current circumstances, they have absolutely nothing to be concerned about, because we are such a tiny minority. As you know, we can only deliver pin pricks at the moment in this country anyway. America is a different case. And salvation may in the end come from across the pond. But here governments, this particular conservative government sees political advantage in a bellicose policy. It's the one issue where nobody's really criticizing them, or if they're criticizing them, it's for not doing enough to get involved in fighting Russia. So there's naked political self-interest involved as well.
Well, thanks for that. Let me move on now. If we've sorted the technical problems we were experiencing at the beginning in reaching Helga, is Helga with us or not? Somebody's coming up on my
Yes,
Helga. Helga.
Hi.
I'm delighted you're been able to join us. Lovely to meet you, albeit in this virtual sense. But I don't know if you heard the introduction, but I was, setting out the backcloth really to where we are as we approach the 78th anniversary of the awful dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima in Japan at the end of, or towards the end of the Second World War. And Donald, in his contribution, was talking about the sort of European politicians who are seemingly enthralled to the United States of America. And I'm thinking in particular, and you're based in Germany, aren't you? How the sanctions have impacted. I mean, they've impacted across Europe, and certainly we're feeling the effects in terms of how they've blown back on the European population. We're certainly feeling it here, but I would imagine you're feeling even more acutely, aren't you, in Germany with the impact on the economy there. What's your take on why German political leaders seem to be so in awe of the US and seemingly unwilling to push back against the sanctions and against a war, which Germany is much closer to than the United States of America. It's a curious state of affairs, isn't it?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I think that the particular case of Germany is probably the worst of all of them, because right now, what we are experiencing with the present government being a complete vessel of the US, and I hate to say also your government, which has a big role in this, we are losing everything what generations were building after the Second World War out of the rubble field. I mean, Germany is being deindustrialized right now. The population, is, some people just are indifferent and they believe the mainstream media, which has a very tight control over the narrative of what is going on. But I would say that a growing majority of the people are completely desperate. They just feel helpless. 22% are now, according to the polls, going to the alternative for Germany. But I would say at least 40, 50 more percent are absolutely desperate. You scratch on the surface and the people are, they're almost crying. They say everything is falling apart. Nothing works anymore. And I predict, that we are going to see an explosion in Germany, because you cannot do this, what you are doing to this country right now. I mean, obviously the control right now is still extremely strong, and you have to take into account almost the entire post-war history of Germany to understand why this is happening. I mean, first of all, after the Second World War, it was the occupying powers who installed political structures. They said who should be the political leader in what party. They gave the licenses to the newspapers, and that was maintained the entire period until the German unification, with very few exceptions. You had some little signs of sovereignty when you had a unusually strong political leader, like I would say Helmut Schmidt. He was standing up in certain ways, or Schröder. He did not go with the Iraq war. But most of the other politicians were very carefully selected by the Anglo-American occupying powers. And, when the unification came, where Germany, because of the peaceful demonstrations in the East and the following unification, really would have gained its sovereignty. I mean, that would have been formally the case. But, if you then look what happened with Herrhausen got assassinated on the 30th of November, this was a clear message to Helmut Kohl not to step out of line. A little bit later, Rohwedder was assassinated just at the point when he was saying that the privatization in East Germany should not take the first place. There should be social concerns first. Then he was killed, and he was replaced by a woman who was absolutely going for privatization in the interest of big money, without consideration for any social consequences. So the structures were, again, really, all the parties have Atlanticists in them. I mean, if you give me a piece of paper, I can tell you in each party who are the absolute diehard in the wool Atlanticists. And especially in the last 5 years, I would say that the Green Party, which, started to pretend to be a little bit for peace, but now they are the biggest war hawks.
Yes.
And I was really wondering, how came that in February, Scholz still said, let's not send weapons to, war zones, because this may lead to World War III. And then, overnight, more weapons, more heavy weapons, first light tanks, then heavy tanks. Now the Greens are even talking about Taurus cruise missiles to be delivered. So I was wondering, how comes that after the 24th of February, all these politicians and think tank people and mainstream media fell into like one line, saying all the same thing, having one narrative. There is an epochal change. Now basically Russia is the demon. And you could not even say that there is a history which was before 24th of February. In Germany, it's as bad as now, that you can get heavy money fines if you say that history started maybe on the 22nd of February, or even the 20th of, there are people threatened with jail if they say this. So I think we are going in the direction of a dictatorship. And, the role of the Greens in preparing this infiltration, I would say, of all the institutions, all the think tanks, is really something one should investigate very much, because this is, I'm really very upset, because Germany is about to go crash against the wall, with war, without war, because what is happening right now is a complete deindustrialization of Germany, and that will have a huge impact on all of Europe.
No, indeed. Well, I mean, of course, Germany has been the economic powerhouse of Europe for, 50, 60 years. Been looked at with, envious eyes, I've got to say, from the United Kingdom. But I'm struck by what you mentioned about the Green Party, Helga, because, traditionally we've often thought, haven't we, as the Green Party being a party of peace, opposed to nuclear weapons, very much for demilitarization rather than promoting. And yet in Germany, you're saying they are the war hawks. Here in Britain, the Green Party has changed its position and now has a position in support of NATO. How do you account for that? What's going on with the Greens here? I mean, have they been infiltrated? Have they taken leave of their senses? What's happening? It just seems really bizarre.
Well, I think the transformation of the German Greens happened around the war against Yugoslavia, where NATO committed the first war without a UN mandate. And Joschka Fischer was the key person transforming the Greens in Germany. And he was a protege of Madeleine Albright. Again, a lot of personal benefits as a payment for it in many ways. But I think what's going on in the larger part, I think, is that this whole war would not happen without the fact that the neoliberal financial system is on the verge of bankruptcy. It was de facto already bankrupt in 2008, where we had a systemic crisis, and then rather than solving the problem at the roots, the international financial community decided to go for quantitative easing. Printing money like crazy, trillions of dollars and pounds and euros were put into the system, and now we are again at the same situation. And then at a certain point, I think it was 2019, the central bankers and other top financiers at their yearly Jackson Hole meeting in Wyoming decided that they had to go for the Great Reset to basically, revamp the entire economy one last time, go for another big bubble. And basically then the whole green agenda became not the agenda of the Green Party, but the agenda of big finance. And, for example, Ursula von der Leyen, she declared the Great Green Deal, which is exactly what the EU is now doing. So but the Green members, the members of the Green Party, should start thinking about how comes that peace parties were transformed into the most hawkish parties of all, and how comes that all the major corporations and banks and financial institutions are pushing now the green policies in the purest form. So that should, if I would be a member of the Green Party, I would start thinking maybe my party has been taken over completely, and maybe that's not the place to be. I mean, I'm really asking the Green members to leave these parties, because if they have any sense of morality left, they should recognize what has happened.
Yes. Well, you mentioned in your earlier remark, Helga, that a lot of people are despairing in Germany, and indeed are turning to other political movements. So, when the elections come, maybe there is hope of change. And just on the point about, printing money, I mean, that was done just obviously to sustain a broken system. I mean, if they'd used that printing of money to invest in the economy and on real things, then clearly that would have been a very different outcome. But that wasn't the decision that was taken. But let me move on now, and thank you, Helga, for that, to David Clues, if I can. David, you are the chief correspondent, I believe, for Unity News Network. We are not well served, it seems to me, by certainly the corporate media. What do you make of the way in which the corporate media have got on board with this? Well, there are no dissenting voices. I mean, I remember the Iraq War. I mean, you got newspapers like the Daily Mirror, when Piers Morgan, of all people, was the editor. They were very critical of the decision to go to war. And it seemed that the fourth estate was, to a limited extent anyway, holding the executive, holding the government to account. That doesn't seem to be the case now. They're all cheerleaders for war, aren't they? What's happening?
Well, first of all, Chris, thanks very much for having me on and such an esteemed panel and such an enlightened and informed discussion. And as you quite rightly point out, the lack of a debate or an analysis of this situation is frightening. And the mainstream, I mean, I think there's a variety of reasons for it. I think if you look at the situation with Russia, Russophobia has been pushed, I mean, at least for the last 10 years, and it really ramped up in the last 5 years. So I think for a lot of people, especially around the Brexit referendum, well, it was the Russians that financed it and blah, blah, blah. And I think as well, because Russia doesn't have the, perhaps the Western values on certain issues that we would describe as woke, I think it's actually quite easy for the media just to hate on Russia and the journalistic class as well. And it's just so misplaced. And there's been no debate. It's been absolutely disgusting. And anyone that's tried to talk about, you're just a Putin apologist and are you paid for by the Kremlin, seems to be the big one. And I mean, they've got our bank account details. We're still yet to receive the rubles. I'm only kidding. It's such a poor show, and the lack of debate on it is abysmal. And even as well, like, people don't even talk about this. I mean, as much as it was a long time ago, people had a debate about World War II. In the 1930s, there was a lot of different opinions, a lot of different sides, a lot of arguments. And this is really the first time I can remember. I think as well, the bombing of Serbia was very bad. I remember that specifically. It was very, very bad. The mainstream media were horrific. The only one that actually spoke a lot of sense, and I remember it vividly, was Tony Benn. When he went on Newsnight famously and said, well, look, what exactly are we doing here? It's such a poor show. And we're in this absolute mess that we're in.
No, indeed. I mean, what do you make as well, of course? I mean, you've got this kind of universal cheerleading for the war in Ukraine from the mainstream media, but also any dissenting voices, like, for example, RT, being banned from the airwaves. I mean, RT didn't have a particularly huge viewership, but it seems they won't brook any alternative narrative and want to close it down. I mean, how do you respond to that?
When the conflict first started in 2014, but when the Russian incursion, this SMO, started in February 2022, I only watched RT because that was the only place you actually got some balanced coverage. And decent. I mean, I remember turning on the BBC and Orla Guerin was there, and these people are fighting for their blood and they're fighting for their soil, and I'm like, excuse me, blood, and I was just like, what the heck? And I would turn on RT and they would say, look, this is a situation. This is what the Ukrainians are saying. This is what the Kremlin is saying, and obviously you couldn't have that. And I mean, I think we're in this stage though where even, Chris, the media have had a fatigue over this conflict. I know I certainly feel that, and I just want to bring one thing to your attention, Chris, and this is a huge story, and it kind of has gone under the radar. We actually covered this on the website, which just shows the horror of it. But Ukrainians, the birth rate in Ukraine has collapsed by 30%. There's only been 16,000 babies a month born compared to 23,000 previously. And this was an actual statistic by the UN. The population of Ukraine is actually set to collapse by 50% by 2050. 27 years, and you've got this situation where you've got hundreds of thousands of young men dying on the battlefield. The Ukrainians are seeing their country destroyed by their own government and by their becoming a lapdog of the West and fighting this needless proxy conflict. And it's absolutely horrific. And I actually do have a degree of sympathy for the average Ukrainian person, the average Ukrainian soldier, because they probably think that they're fighting for their land and they're fighting to preserve their way of life. No, they're not. They're fighting for Larry Fink at BlackRock to come over and buy up all their assets. It's hellish. And I just wish they would waken up.
Well, I think some are, to be fair. I mean, I've seen some footage of, albeit Ukrainian POWs who have been very critical, and indeed some are thinking about it, actually, who have expressed a contrary view, become very disillusioned, I think, with their leadership, and are, challenging the direction. I mean, we've seen, haven't we, images of people literally press ganged into the Ukrainian meat grinder, otherwise known as the Ukrainian military. I mean, isn't it incredible that we're not seeing the corporate media actually, properly reporting on this? I mean, how are you? I mean, what sort of response? I mean, clearly, you are putting that alternative narrative out there, David. I mean, how are you being received by, as best you can judge, by the public for the sort of information that you are disseminating?
Well, as I said, I think what we have tried to say is, as I said, I like some of Putin's stuff, but I'm actually not overly a fan of what goes on in Russia. It's not without its problems, but what the overall from people is, you're just a Putin stooge. But I think a lot of people, especially in the sort of alt media world, they recognise this, and people have come to us and they have watched us and they have listened to what we have to say and they've come on board. But again, our megaphone is just so small, and without access to the main channels or anything. I mean, aside from really GB News and Talk TV, which I think I've had David Curtin on a couple of times to give a contrary opinion, there has been absolutely nothing. So people are coming to us, they'll see the videos, they'll see the footage that we're publishing. We do focus on that, about these people being forced to go. We publish a lot of the images of the cemeteries that are ever expanding, and just the tragedy and the horror, and also the corruption that exists in Ukraine. Nobody's talking about the endemic corruption that is there. You see the cars driving around Kiev. That people are. It's absolutely horrific, and I think. But the other problem is, though, Chris, and I'm sure you know this, apathy rules supreme. Most people just it's day 500 odd, whatever it is, they've sort of given up. And I think even the governments of the West I'm not saying they've given up, but I haven't seen any major announcements recently. I haven't seen any £1 billion announcements, 2 billion, or we're sending X amount of weapons. It's just this grinding stalemate we find ourselves in.
Yes, indeed. I was amused actually by your reference to the Kremlin Gold. It took me back to my days as a hunt saboteur in the 1970s. It's such a lazy put down accusation which is thrown against anybody who is railing against the establishment. And I remember the hunting fraternity used to regularly accuse the hunt saboteurs of receiving Kremlin Gold. I mean, would that it were the case. I mean, it's such a ridiculous, nonsensical, lazy argument to put forward. And it's just amusing to see that it's still actually being used to this day. But look, don't underestimate, your influence and the influence of the independent media and social media, because they are important channels for us, important platforms, and we're getting, I think, increasingly to a larger number of people. I think people are beginning to wake up, because regrettably the mainstream media doesn't have the giants like John Pilger amongst their number anymore. I mean, John himself, Pilger, who is still broadcasting, but he's been pushed to the independent platforms himself to get his message out, as indeed many other influential reporters of days gone by, when they used to have a platform on the mainstream media. I mean, George Galloway, he's not with us this evening, for example, himself was ubiquitous during the on the mainstream media channels during the Iraq war, but George has never been given a platform at all in this event. But
I think back to your point at the start, Chris, as well, is I can't understand. There's the outright hatred of all Russians. That's
No,
the thing as
exactly.
well. All Russians. Because
Yes, absolutely.
this is we're always told. Say when there's a terror attack or something. Well, not all people are, and everyone gets that. But yet with this one, it's all Russians are bad. The entire Russian
Yes.
regime is bad. Everyone that's in a position of power in Russia is bad. The average Russian person it's completely off the charts, and
Completely.
no nuance allowed whatsoever. And you saw it when there was that poor Russian died in the Red Sea. He was eaten by a shark, and people were laughing about it, and people were
Disgraceful.
it really is. It's horrific, and Russia is a proud country with a proud history, and I think you see that now with the way the rest of the world treats Russia. That they know it's not a country that you underestimate, and people look at America, they look at its allies and say, well, look, we can't do business with these people. They're completely untrustworthy. Russia is what it is, but at least we know they'll deal with us in a fair and upfront manner, not like the West.
Indeed. Well, let me move on. Thank you for that, David. Let me move on to Dan, if I can. Dan Kovalik, if we can get him up on the screen. Dan, hi. Thanks for joining us this evening. I really appreciate you being on with us tonight to give us the benefit of your thoughts. I don't know if you heard Peter Ford, the former British diplomat, saying that salvation may come from the United States of America. Are we reliant upon a re-election of Donald Trump or possibly Robert F. Kennedy to the presidency to bring this war to an end, do you think, or not?
Well, it's a great question. I think that regardless of who's elected, the people of this country need to make their voices clear, need to build a peace movement that's going to hold our leaders' feet to the fire. I mean, that's really what's critical. We haven't seen a peace movement, a robust peace movement in the United States since 2003 when the Iraq War began. And we need to recapture that spirit again.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, isn't it curious? I mean, how do you read the kind of political situation then in the United States when you've got somebody like, Donald Trump seems to be the best hope for peace, or maybe Robert Kennedy as well from the other side of the political spectrum. But I mean, this seems very odd given the history of politics in the US. I mean, how do you see it?
Yeah, it is very odd. Yeah, no, what you're seeing is correct. First of all, I'll just, in the interest of full disclosure, I am supporting Bobby Kennedy for president. I do have a lot of hope in him, though I think it's going to be a challenge for him, of course, to be elected. In terms of Trump, you're right. He's saying he could solve the Ukraine crisis in a day, and it's probably true. And it is interesting that Republicans. The polls clearly show Republicans are more against the war in Ukraine by a large margin than the Democratic base. And this is a switch, right? At least the base of the Democratic Party has tended to be more dovish, right, than Republicans. And there has been this switch. And I think, there's probably a lot of reasons for that. I think a big reason is Obama-Biden, that essentially I think Obama primed liberals to embrace war again, is the truth of it. They looked the other way when he, helped lead the NATO bombing of Libya, which was an abomination, which just destroyed that country. He was Mr. Drone, right? He launched more bombings in drones, I think, than any president in history. And the Democrats just decided they would be okay with that, and they got used to that. And Biden is similar. Look at, again, with his support for the conflict in Ukraine, for his provocation of this war in Ukraine, the liberals have just jumped on the bandwagon. And again, the polls show 81% of Democrats support the war in Ukraine, whereas amongst Republicans, that number is like 51% of Republicans. So that's an incredible difference. And so that's what we're dealing with politically in the United States. having to turn those numbers around amongst liberals and amongst Democrats. I do hope that win, lose, or draw, the Kennedy's campaign as a Democrat will at least raise this issue, will create debate on this issue, and hopefully peel some of those Democrats away from war.
Yeah. How optimistic are you, Dan, that things can shift in the United States then?
Well, I would say, it's the old line, intellectually I'm a pessimist, but my heart is optimistic. I mean, obviously, we have to keep hope alive, or we wouldn't be on this program. We wouldn't do what we do, right?
No.
I think I've always tried to believe that Americans at heart are decent people. I think that is true. I think a lot of times when they support the wrong things like war, it's out of ignorance. And I think, of course, the ignorance around Ukraine has been imposed from above. I've never seen a more effective and insidious propaganda campaign than I have around Ukraine, where the papers have just scoffed at the idea that somehow this war was provoked, have tried to convince people that this war began last year when all of us on this call know it started in 2014. By the way, I've been to the Donbass twice in the last 8 months and have seen and witnessed the fact that this war has affected these people now for 9 years and counting. That the media has scoffed at the idea that there's neo-Nazis fighting for Ukraine, when again, that's very clear and evident. And in fact, even the New York Times kind of had to wring its hands a couple months ago at all the people with Nazi insignia fighting for Ukraine, and what a bad
they did.
Was.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
it was difficult to get a photograph of a Ukrainian soldier without some sort of Nazi regalia, either a tattoo or some emblem on their uniform. It was astonishing.
Absolutely. And instead of, the media saying, oh, well, that might mean they're Nazis, they're like, oh, well, that's a horrible coincidence. Well, it's not a coincidence, but that's what we're dealing against. And that's why we do what we do. That's why we have these discussions, to remind people the truth.
Yeah. How do you account then for the media standing up? Well, I don't know, maybe it wasn't the case in the United States, but certainly in the United Kingdom, before Russia's military operation, and before certainly the build-up, there were regularly reports in the British corporate media exposing the Ukrainian far right, exposing the Nazis on mainstream broadcast channels, and then suddenly that's all been swept under the carpet, and they've certainly, they're literally standing on their head, the corporate media in this country. Is that the same in the United States? I mean, were there sort of exposes in the likes of the New York Times, Washington Post, etc., some of the heavyweight newspapers, exposing the kind of Nazi right-wing influence in Ukraine prior to this present period, or not?
There was some of that. There was some coverage. I would say not enough coverage. And there was not enough coverage of the war in the Donbass. I do think had there been the sustained type of coverage that it warranted, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. There was some coverage, not enough. But yeah, once Russia intervened last year on February 24th, then all of that was just forgotten. While there wasn't enough coverage, there was some, but any coverage that existed was just utterly forgotten. The algorithms on Google suppressed all those things. I've been writing about the war in the Donbass for years, and I can't even find my old articles, in a Google search, because they suppress all those old things. I even saw, I was doing an article and trying to find the UN Human Rights Commission's report that said 14,000 people had died in the Donbass war since 2014. And when I went and clicked on the link to that report, it said that it was gone, right? So, I mean, to the extent there had been reporting, that had been largely deep-sixed. But again, there really was never enough reporting on that. And so what people kind of came into this largely with a clean slate, and therefore were easily misled as to the reasons for this war.
Right, yeah. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Dan. let me see. I don't know if we've managed to get Richard Medhurst, but if we haven't, can I just bring Angela back in, Angela McCall, and just get your thoughts, Angela, on? It looks like we've not got Richard. Angela, I mean, perhaps we'll just do a round, just get reactions really from our esteemed contributors tonight to what they've heard. I mean, what do you make of what you've heard so far this evening, Angela?
I think there's been a lot of good insights. One of the things, and I can't even remember what it was that set it off, but I think we were wondering, why are people not more aware of what's going on, and especially with the whole Nazi stuff and it being really transparent. So I want to kind of float this theory by you guys, and I want your feedback. I think this is tied to the rise of the oppression narrative. And this is very evident in the United States, but I don't know how much of an issue it is in Europe. In the early 2000s, fighting the war on terror was associated with manliness and the military might of the United States. How dare anyone mess with us? We're going to go and we're going to crush them. And I don't see that sentiment in the being expressed generally in all the wars that we have across the world right now, but especially not in the Ukraine-Russia war. We had the rise of the oppression narrative maybe in the early 2010s. I especially saw it take off in 2014. And my perspective on it is that it's sort of rooted in the Marxist class struggle, but then it bled out into different demographics. We got race, gender, sexual orientation, and now it's countries. And so the narrative is Ukraine is being oppressed. They've been absorbed into what I consider like the oppressed class pantheon, along with transgender people, racial minorities. We also saw it in the United States with the lockdowns. It was that unvaccinated people were oppressing everybody else who was complying. And so instead of looking for freedom or talking common sense, we have people who are looking for liberation from oppression. And I think that that's why it's become such an acceptable mainstream view over here, and why you see kind of such a strange alignment across the board with these different groups who are ordinarily, I would think, well, people who are, classically considered woke. That's what it was. When David started talking about woke, this is what set my mind off. People who talk about those sort of things, they're not normally sympathetic to the United States military murdering people overseas. That's so weird to me. But I think that this is how they've sort of done those mental gymnastics. And neocons, they love the oppression narrative because they can co-opt it to their own means and exploit it. So,
yeah. Helga, what do you make of that assessment from Andrew? And indeed, do you have any comments on anything else that's been said in the discussion this evening?
Well, I have a slightly different perspective because, I mean, the really big epochal change which is taking place is not the one Chancellor Scholz was talking about. It is a very, I would say it's an epochal change of about 500-600 years, because we are seeing right now that the era of colonialism is coming to an end. That is basically, I have to take it one step back. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Fukuyama said this is the end of history, and it implied the idea that the whole world would take the neoliberal model of economy. And when China was permitted into the WTO, the idea was China would become a Western democracy following the same laws. And that did not happen. As a matter of fact, China did something very different. They went back to their 5,000 year of history, and they became more Chinese than ever before by reviving their cultural tradition. Then they adopted the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, the Schiller Institute has a lot to do with it, because that was the Eurasian Land Bridge was our answer to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and myself developed as a strategy to have a peace order of the 21st century by connecting Europe and Asia through economic development corridors. And that is very much the same idea what then Xi Jinping did in 2013 in Kazakhstan when he announced the new Silk Road. Now, in the 10 years since, that has been the largest infrastructure program in world history ever. The developing countries for the very first time had the chance to overcome poverty and under development. And now, you have when the United States started to recognize China as a rival, this started about 2017 in the Pentagon security papers, the tone against China and Russia started to change dramatically. They were all of a sudden called systemic rivals and enemies and so forth. And all the think tanks, I watched this because we are very much involved in this as our project. All the think tanks, all the mainstream media started to change the tone, starting to paint Russia and China as dictatorships, as autocratic regimes. And then when the sanctions started, which started long before the Ukraine war, many countries in the developing countries looked at that. They said, oh, later on, $300 billion of Russia was confiscated. Then 9 billion from Afghanistan was confiscated. Venezuela, other countries were hit with incredible sanctions. So they started to say, maybe it's not such a good idea to stay in the dollar. And the de-dollarization process started. And you have right now a completely different attitude of the non-aligned movement. They want to build their own currency. They want to have their own economic system. And I think that the Ukraine war, if you really look at it, and I think Putin said this already years before the Ukraine war broke out, if they would not have found Ukraine, they would have found another issue. Because the issue was from the very beginning to contain Russia. When Yeltsin went along to, basically fulfill the plans of the Western oligarchs to sell out Russia as an industrial power and reduce it to a raw material exporting third world country, they had no problem with Russia. There was no Russophobia with Yeltsin. But when Putin came in and he started to very carefully and, with difficulties, because these oligarchs were vested interest and not so easy to deal with, when he started to re-establish or try to re-establish Russia as a global player, they went absolutely bananas. Obama said Russia is only a regional player, and this was regarded as a big insight in Russia. So in the meantime, the rise of China continued. China has made an economic miracle which is unprecedented in all of history. They lifted 850 million people out of poverty, and they eradicated severe poverty by the end of 2020. And that has been watched by Africa, Latin America, other Asian countries, and then China offering win-win joint cooperation. So right now, the majority of the global South does not join with the West in condemning Russia. There were incredible efforts. Ursula von der Leyen, Baerbock, all of these people were running around Brazil, Africa, trying to put pressure on Africa, on Latin American countries to condemn Russia. But they refuse to do it for a variety of reasons. First of all, they're not stupid. They have, they are not exactly reading the mainstream media of Germany or Britain, or, they have their own papers and they have their own colonial experience, where Russia was very much on the side of the anti-colonial struggle. And many people in Africa, leaders, regard Russia as a friend and China as a friend. And you can see this right now, what happened in Niger, with the coup.
Yes, of course. Indeed.
And Burkina Faso joined basically with the military in Niger, who basically say, and what's the issue there? This is very important. The issue is not what is written in the mainstream media. The issue is that Niger is one of the key producers of uranium, and that is what France needs for its nuclear energy. And up to now, it was French companies and other international corporations who helped the people in Niger to mine this uranium, but making the vast part of the profit. And Africa is now in a mood where they say, we do not want to be in a colonial situation any longer. We want to have the right to process our own resources, to have industrial production, to become middle-class income countries in a foreseeable time. And so therefore, I think what's underlying this whole conflict is something completely different. I see it as an epochal change, whereas 500 or 600 years of colonialism is coming to an end. And these countries of the global south have found friendly partners in China, in Russia. And that is why I think, the real issue in my view is we must succeed not only to oppose the war, but we must find a way to cooperate. We have to move the populations of Europe, of the United States, from confrontation to cooperation. If we don't succeed in swinging the public opinion in Germany, in England, in Great Britain, in America, where they say, okay, we should cooperate with this new emerging new world economic order, then we will have World War III. I cannot see a third option. Either we succeed in getting the, for example, the industry in Germany, they will only survive if we cooperate with the global south. That will be a life and death question for Germany, but also I think for all the other countries of the West. So I have proposed already a long time ago, almost a year ago, a new security and development architecture, which takes into the interest of every single country on the planet, very much in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia. Because if you remember, the Peace of Westphalia ended 150 years of religious war in Europe. And the reason why the warring parties were sitting down on the table is because they recognized if they wouldn't do that, there would be absolutely nobody left to enjoy the victory because they would all be dead.
No. Let me bring in. Sorry, go on. Just finish your point there, Angela. Sorry, Helga. Just finish that point you were just about to make. Sorry, I cut across you there.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to bring in Donald actually, just to kind of respond really, because I suspect, Your Excellency, you would agree with much of, if not all of, what Helga was just saying there. I wonder perhaps if you could maybe comment on that and any other things that you've heard during tonight's discussion.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what Helga has said, indeed. But what I wanted to probably emphasize, some of the points that have been raised here is I think that the Americans in particular, and the mainstream media in the West in general, have learned a lot from Vietnam and how to undermine, how to prevent a situation like that happening again, as the kind of solidarity that Vietnam generated in the West itself, in the United States and in Europe, that helped to bring that war to an end. And since then, they have moved in different directions to prevent that. The other thing that I think I see is it's something I've have some general ideas about, but don't have all the facts that maybe you people will have, is to look at the interlocking ownership of the media, the mainstream media, with not only the military industrial complex, but with financial people and so forth as well. And I think that is part of it's not just the media, but it's a total strategy linked with people who wants to rule the world, to put it in that way, and to dominate. Because how else do you explain the fact that in demonizing Russia, it's not only the demonization of Putin, but the banning of sportsmen, cultural people.
It's absurd.
Books.
Yes, it's absurd.
Books.
Incredible.
How do you ban Pushkin? And how do you ban and look at Medvedev playing tennis in the West? He's being harassed, even to some extent. Djokovic, who is a Slav, seems to be at the negative end of and the mentality. They have succeeded in turning the mentality of the crowd in that way. Sports, culture, everything that they are using in the demonization process in order to justify their big expenditure and their control of everything that they have. There was another point that was made that I've seen that Putin made comments of, and maybe we should try to see if we can flesh that out to see the facts. He was mentioning one of the reasons that he used for stopping the grain deal that was there. That he was saying that it was benefiting the big corporations, and some names like BlackRock came about of buying up a lot of Ukrainian lands, agricultural lands, and so forth. And I mean, that kind of information, I think, has not filtered out enough into the world to see how the large corporations are taking over a lot of the agricultural lands that they have. And in the media too itself, there's a lot of fantastic analysis that sometimes I get from looking at YouTube, like Jeffrey Sachs or
Yes,
or
very good.
or John Mearsheimer
Yes,
or
Mearsheimer, particularly good. Yeah,
I read some good articles from one of the last ambassadors of the United States in the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock Jr., who wrote a very many good pieces. One of which was "I Was There." That was a very good piece that and I think it clearly showed that what is happening today was an American who could not resist taking advantage of a weakened Russia to try to ensure that they never rise again to challenge them in any way. Um, and just a general comment of a general interest, because it's something I've been following and listening to the talk about what is happening with the Greens in Germany and so forth. I mean, one, it's horrible to think that they call themselves Greens, and I have not heard a word of criticism and condemnation about the blowing up of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is probably one of the worst type of ecological disaster, man-made ecological disaster that exists. So a lot of the talk, therefore, that these people, knowing that climate change is real, but they're willing to keep quiet and to, in a way, to encourage that type of action if it will hurt your enemies. That is what they, even though it means that it can have such a big impact on the rest of the world. And in the international politics today, I believe the question of left and right is getting very, very blurred, in my view. Because I found myself a long time ago. I mean, I wasn't surprised when Tucker Carlson was removed from Fox News, because I found myself for a while agreeing with a lot of what Tucker Carlson was saying on Fox News. And he was supposed to be in a big right wing, but he is more, he seems to be more realistic than many of the people who talk on the left, who seems to be forgetting. I know that historically, people on the left normally look at class issues among other issues and so forth. But now they have abandoned all of that, and it seems to me that LGBTQ and all of that seems to be the biggest thing for the left, and class and workers' interests seems to have taken a back seat in
identity politics has trumped class politics, it seems. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, but as Helga said, it coming to the end of her presentation, something I agree with. I think in all of these negatives, there is emerging a positive, that an alternative is developing because of the overuse of sanctions and overuse of the dollar and so forth, is now creating a possibility where there seems to be emerging an alternative direction, and China's win-win type of foreign policy and economic relations with other countries is gaining in grounds in all the countries. People are not easily being swayed away from China, although there's a lot of pressure being put on governments not to have that kind of relationship with them. So I would say the positive that is coming out is that there seems to be emerging an alternative. But the fear, to my mind, is how do we act as fast as possible to prevent this thing from deteriorating even further. It is clear that Ukraine has lost the war, and now it looks to me, I mean, from the distance that I am, it looks to me as if there is an attempt to push Poland to fill the gap that Ukraine seems to be losing out at this point in time. So that would be my question. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Your Excellency, for your insight. It's very, very valuable, and we again appreciate you taking the time out to join us this evening. And I'm sure our viewers will have benefited very much from hearing your words of wisdom. But Peter Ford, if I may bring Peter back in for some concluding comments, and I don't know whether Peter you would want to comment, if Peter's still with us, on what Donald has just said about the insidious influence of corporations and so on. Is Peter with us, or have we lost him? I don't think we've got Peter. Let me perhaps then bring in David Clues back then, if David's still with us. Is David with us?
Yeah, I'm here, Chris.
Yeah, David. I mean, what's your thoughts then on that in relation to the insidious influence of corporations that Donald was just referring to there, and the possibility indeed of Poland being sort of pushed into this disaster?
It's interesting because I have a very strong link with Poland. The my mother of my child, she's Polish, and my wife as well, and she's actually right on the border with Belarus, and it's hysterical in Poland the way they've behaved over this. They've just completely lost the plot. Although I did notice recently that there was a bit of an argy-bargy because one of them asked for the Ukrainians to be a wee bit more grateful for the support they've given. But as I said, the Polish government have just completely lost the plot. I don't know what they're playing at. They've got far more in common with Belarus and Russia than they do with the NATO alliance. They're very, very similar people. Maybe it's a bit more like family falling out, but you look at that situation, and if there is talk of Poland going in, taking Western Ukraine, absolute insanity. And it's interesting in Poland because, of course, they like to blame Russia for communism, but it was actually Polish people that were in charge at the time, and their mindset's just it's all over the place on that. And I really, really struggle. And I was thinking that the great points that Donald was making, and also Helga, and I was thinking about this a lot. The reason we're in this mess is because NATO should have ceased to exist in 1991. There was no need. There was no need for NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then what was done to Russia in the early 90s was horrific. The country was raped. The people, the humiliation that they went through in the 90s, and yet here we are. And Helga, I thought, made some excellent points there as well. And it's interesting. Donald was talking about that, but Tucker Carlson as well. Is if you believe the mainstream media, you're a far left anti-Semitic extremist, and I'm a far right conspiracy theorist. When in reality, people like you and I, Donald, Helga, we're actually able to have a nuanced and adult debate about this, and it's a really low form of politics that people just resort to war to solve their problems or conflict. People should be able to. You'd think in 2023 people would be able to sit down and actually have a debate. And the other point as well, Donald was making about Nord Stream being blown up in Helga as well. We're being told that it's global boiling now, that climate change is out of control, but at the same time we're sending Ukraine cluster bombs, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, blowing up all sort. I mean, I'm sorry, is there a bit of a disconnect there between the two? And it's just
cognitive dissonance, it seems, isn't it?
Hypocrisy completely off the charts, Chris. And if you look at this conflict for 5 minutes, bypass what you're being told by algorithms on social media, by the MSM, you realise this thing is a farce, but it's a deadly and dangerous farce as well.
No, indeed. Well, let me give, if Dan is still with us, Dan Kovalik, the last word to Dan. Is Dan still with us?
Yes, I am
Dan, here. Concluding comments from you, Dan, on what you've heard, and anything else you want to say before we close the discussion this evening?
Yeah, I would just conclude by saying, we live in very dangerous times. Joe Biden himself recently said that we're closer to nuclear apocalypse. He used that word apocalypse than we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And yet he doesn't seem to want to do anything to move us from the brink of that, which is quite scary. It used to be, at least as bad as our presidents have been, at least they saw their job as trying to protect us from the worst, from World War III and nuclear war. And yet Biden seems to be trying to rush us into that. And so I think, the work we're doing is critical. People need to hit the streets. They need to oppose the war. They need to oppose the escalation of the war. They need to get out on the streets on Sunday and oppose nuclear war and the legacy of Hiroshima. And so those will be my concluding words.
Well, listen, thank you very much indeed, then, Dan, for your concluding comments and your remarks earlier on, and indeed for taking the time out to join us. I know you've got a very busy schedule, and we do very much appreciate you taking the time out to be with us tonight. And let me also thank Angela McCardle, Donald Ramota, Peter Ford, Helga Zepp LaRouche, and David Clues as well. The final word from me, and just picking up on the point that Dan was just making there about hitting the streets on Sunday, absolutely crucial. We have a rally in Whitehall opposite Downing Street from 1 o'clock to show our opposition to NATO, our opposition to war, and opposition particularly to nuclear war. We've got an excellent group of speakers who will be joining us there. So if you have the time, and particularly if you're based in London, please do come and join us in Whitehall, opposite Downing Street, on Sunday. Peter said at the moment the No2Nato movement is a pinprick, a small pinprick. We are growing, however, but the thing about pinpricks is they can burst balloons, and our task, our job, our duty is to burst this balloon, which is leading us closer and closer to Armageddon, to a potential third world war, and possibly a nuclear holocaust. So thank you, everybody, for watching this evening. Thanks again to all our speakers. We hope to have another No2Nato, No2War broadcast in a week or two's time. So look out for the advertising for that, and join us then. But until then, this is Chris Williams saying good night and goodbye, and take care.